Let's talk about how the Germans made some of the best grips of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Listen, don't mention the war.
Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, you're used to me talking about British military swords and, earlier periods of things, rapiers, side swords, arming swords, long swords, things like this. But I don't talk that much on the channel about 19th century swords, aka sabres as most people would generically call them, from other countries, and I probably should talk more about them, especially because I do actually deal in the things and I have a fair few through my hands. Now, it just so happens I have a couple of examples of German swords. We'll unpack that term in a second. We'll generically call them German swords here at the moment, and I thought great topic because I think a lot of people don't realise how innovative and influential, and I'll explain that in a second, German grip design was on 19th century swords. Now, in the 19th century, people were looking at military swords in different ways. Obviously, firearm technology had come forward in leaps and bounds, but swords, lances and bayonets and cutlasses still did have a place in warfare. So much so that the first British kill, at least noted in World War I, was with a cavalry sword. Bayonets were used extensively in World War I. And officers' swords were used certainly at the beginning, although by about 1915 they'd been relegated for the most part. I've made a video about that. It's not for the reason you might think. It's not because swords aren't still effective in hand-to-hand combat, because remember, they still did trench raids with clubs and knives and knuckle dusters and stuff like this, and shovels. So hand weapons were still an important thing. Actually, the point was that officers on all sides were being shot by marksmen at a much higher rate than private soldiers, because obviously if you can take out the officer, it causes a lot of problems for the coordination and management of the unit. So officers were being targeted and they were easy to spot because they were waving swords around. So after that, they tried to make themselves look less conspicuous. Right, so swords were still important in World War I, but let's go back earlier than that. Let's go back to the 1890s. So I've written some articles about this on the Easton Antique Arms website, talking specifically about British swords. Now, British swords, if I just grab an example here of the 1896 cavalry pattern, the infantry patterns got a similar grip. You'll notice the British grip is completely straight. This is actually a patent solid hilt, so it's perhaps even straighter than average because of the way that the tang is a full width. But the important part for the British swords is up the back we have a very straight back piece. A lot of people call this a back strap, incidentally, which is really a firearms term. In sword terminology, it should be called a back piece, according to Wilkinson's records anyway. And you'll notice this is fully checkered, okay? That means it's got friction all down the back of it. Now, earlier swords are smoother, and in fact, French swords are still smoother, but the British decided this gave a much better grip, especially when gripping the sword, as was generally taught in fencing and military manuals of the time, with the thumb up the back. And you'll notice they've also made the grip a little bit longer to give enough space for the thumb. So this actually has, in addition to being fully checkered, has a section up here which is a bit table-like, it's a bit flat, and that helps the kind of traction, all of this checkered surface down here and checkered area up there, help the traction of the thumb. So this designer grip very much marries into the way that the sword was supposed to be held in British sabre sword doctrine. Okay, now that was also true in other military circles. I'll talk about French swords another time because French swords are a little bit of a puzzle to me as to why they didn't improve or update their grip designs a little bit more than they did. They stuck with more traditional designs, but here we're looking at German swords. So the first one we're going to look at is actually a Bavarian one, but the Prussians had exactly the same model. And this is the 1889, so you can see we're on the verge of 1890 here, cavalry sword. Now you will notice, the first thing to notice about it is it has a curved back, which if you're giving a thrust on horseback and riding at someone, having a curved back is advantageous because you can get the blade more in line with the straightened arm more easily. Okay, that's the first thing you'll notice. The second thing you'll notice is that it has this heel at the bottom, which was quite common, and that's quite good for comfort, but also for retention of the sword, particularly when you're cutting. But the really important bit to notice is this bit in here. You have got a little crook for the finger, for the index finger, okay? And that is exactly for that. This grip's made of an early form of Bakelite, incidentally. Okay, so this is a cut and thrust blade. You can happily cut with it, you can happily thrust with it, but that finger not quite a choice, I can't think of the word what's the word for that where you stick an index finger? Anyway, notch we'll call it. So that little groove or notch there for your index finger means that you put your thumb up the back and the index finger there, and it forms a good point of leverage, which both assists the cut in controlling that and accelerating the tip a little bit more, because your finger pulls against that. And we'll talk about this feature in a second, because it was done in a different way on the infantry sword. And in addition, it helps with retention. So if the sword gets banged or knocked when you're on horseback, you're less likely to drop it. Now, obviously, this performs a very, very similar function. I'll just pull the most accessible example here. Ironically, this is also a German sword, but from the year 1600, a lot earlier. Obviously, with rapiers and side swords, we have finger rings. So actually, although it's not the same, it actually performs a very similar function. Not only does it make it a more secure grip, but it assists with that leverage, that kind of twitch response, and means that you can move that tip, accelerate that tip a lot more quickly. Okay. Obviously, finger rings on things like small swords come from the same origin, okay, but with these you generally don't put the finger through the ring because it's too small. You just rest the finger against the side. But it's all about increasing the traction, control, indexing of the sword that you are operating, if you want to look at it like that as a machine. Right, so this is a very good design, and I'm a big fan of it. And I've got to say, grips like this are really, really pleasant to use. They stay in the hand really well, they sit in the hand. You've got a little bit better flick with that tip to accelerate that tip and cut with. You've got more control of the tip for thrusting as well, point control. So great, okay. Now let's look at the infantry sword. Now this I like even more for a number of reasons I will demonstrate. So first of all, it's still got this curved shape, but notice it's quite angular. It goes up, then it goes across. This is actually based on Central and Eastern European earlier swords, types of sabre. In fact, the origin swords of the sabre, but we also find it in certain Islamic forms of sabre as well. Anyway, without going too far into the origins, this type of almost pistol shape, you think about a flintlock or percussion lock dueling pistol, is very, very similar, because by holding the hand, let's just get rid of the scabbard for a second, by holding the hand right the way down the bottom here, okay, right the way down at the pommel, you've now got lots of space for the thumb to fit, and it means that you're actually holding this angle down here, just as if you were holding a dueling pistol, okay? So if you were holding an old single shot pistol, then this is the angle that you'd be shooting at. So it's very good for pointing with the point. But in addition to that, it means that the natural angle of the wrist when you cut, the blade is actually forward of that. Instead of being like that and having to fully extend the wrist out forwards here, by angling it like that with the thumb up the back, it means you don't have to expand or open up that wrist joint as much before you're hitting the person. So for these sort of, and you can do it with a moulinet, but I can't in here because I don't have the ceiling space. But for these sort of sudden accelerating cuts, it gives these chop cuts really, really quickly and really, really well. In all honesty, I have never understood why modern Olympic sabres don't have grips more like this. You could, you know, to me, it would make sense. I think it would be advantageous. Leon Paul and other manufacturers out there, pay attention here. Okay, so we've got that. That's the first thing, and that has some similarity to the other one. But instead of the notch for the finger, what we've got here is a loop. Now this is a World War I sword, incidentally. This is Prussian, so this is also an 1889 pattern. So in 1889, the various German states, so Bavaria, Prussia and others, adopted new models of sword. This is the infantry officer's sword, or Degen as it was referred to, spadroon essentially. And the other one is the cavalry sword, which you could loosely call a palash or just Schwert sword. Completely different types of sword, but they do have some design philosophy in parallel. Now that loop, I'm going to be careful with it because, as I say, it's 100-year-old leather. you put your finger through there and it marries up with these things, because it means now the finger, much like the groove on the other sword, the finger has got that point of leverage to pull and anchor and accelerate that tip, while the thumb is up the back here. The rest of your fingers are gripped fully down there, and you'll notice the hand fits like holding a pistol with my finger through the trigger. Very, very similar, very comfortable, very good for controlling the point, for point control, but also very good for accelerating that tip in a cut. And a little detail, a lot of people that try to grip these swords are like, wow, the guard is so confining, the guard's so small. Indeed, if I try and grip this like a normal sword, I cannot fit my hand into that tiny little guard. But as soon as I move the hand down the bottom of the hilt here and put my finger through there and my thumb up the back, now there's no problem. And indeed, that guard doesn't give much hand protection. I'm not really a big fan of this model of sword's guard as a sword guard. I think it should have been bigger, and some of them are bigger. This is a particularly small one. Some of them actually have a folding section, so you can wear it more easily and then fold it out. But it's not a particularly protective guard, but it does make the sword easier to wear, easier to access, and that kind of stuff. It's less likely to get caught up in things. So very, very innovative. Now, one thing I prefer about this is this has got shagreen, or essentially dogfish skin over, and I actually prefer the traction of that surface to the smoother Bakelite surface of the cavalry sword. But these swords weren't entirely, well, they were unique to the German states. So just briefly, I won't go into the history of Germany, but obviously German unification is a thing. In World War I, what we find is the swords being used by different German states. Bavaria has a lion on it, Prussia has the eagle on it, blah, blah, blah. But they're basically the same models in most of the German states. Not all, but most of the German states. But they have different emblems on to represent which German state they're from. Now, funnily enough, you might think that there's no parallel here with British swords, but there is. This is the 1912 British cavalry officer's sword, the 1912 pattern. Now, this is a very iconic design, and many people in British sword circles will point at this as being the ultimate pistol grip. So let's just pull it out of the scabbard for a second. This is a very nice example, incidentally, by Wilkinson, dating to 1918. Service sharpened for World War I, the last year of it. And indeed, this grip has some parallels. It is canted, it is asymmetrical, so it shapes into for the right-handed person. Left-handed people would need a left-handed grip. It's got a thumb placer, but it doesn't have that point of leverage for the index finger here. So again, the British philosophy is somewhat different, and they think a lot about the thumb, but they don't think much about the index finger. So probably subtly different ways that the swords are being gripped and used. Okay, so a lot of people in British circles would consider this grip as the most evolved form of like pistol-like or ergonomic grip on military swords. But here's the thing a lot of people don't know. In the 1880s and 1890s, this form of grip was in its infancy. It wasn't quite as evolved as this. And in the 1880s and 1890s, some British officers chose to have, as an optional non-regulation extra, a specific type of canted grip that is like an early prototype version of this. And it was known as the German grip. And in fact, in Wilkinson records, any of these sort of even slightly canted and ergonomic grips were called German grip. And that's an interesting thing because, of course, they're referring to just Germany as one big entity. And the reason for that is that going back into the 1880s, early 1880s, there was an experimental model of Prussian sword which had a grip a little bit like this. So this ultimately, although it's seen as a British grip, the 1908 and then the 1912 officers, the 1908 is the troopers, actually has its origins in German swords. Now that was a German prototype that this was based on. However, the final German one ended up like this, and actually quite a different model of sword. So, but the fact is that this idea of this slightly canted pistol grip with ergonomic features on it, which would be somewhat familiar, I think, and beloved of modern Olympic style fencers, actually has its origins, or at least a big chunk, if not 100%, it has sort of 75% of its origins and inspiration in German sword design. So there we go. I hope that's been interesting. If you want to know more details about this particular topic, then let me know down in the comments, and maybe I can do some deep dives into some particular aspects of things I've touched on here. But I just really want to say, I think people should appreciate these late 19th century and early 20th century Prussian, Bavarian and other German models of sword, because they're very interesting, and I have to say I'm a big fan of how they handle. They actually handle really lovely, so much so that I've been thinking about getting a HEMA fencing sabre, a gymnasium sabre with a grip like this to try it out, because I think it would really work well for me. It really suits my manner of gripping the sabre very well. Maybe because I'm part Prussian, who knows, which I am. Okay, anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. What would that be in Germany? I don't know. What's the German version of Matthias something, I should think. Matthias, maybe. I have been Matt Easton. I will, of course, be again next time, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.